Hello everyone, my name is Vanessa and I'm from the Geelong Regional Library Corporation, and I am so pleased to be here today and welcome you all to one of our Local Word Writers Festival sessions. And today's panel discussion, Living Place, Writing Place, with panellists Tom Molyneux, Dorothy Johnson, Kishak Akech and panel chair Rhett Davis, who's been a big friend of the library over the last few years, so it's good to see you here again today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation and the Gulajan and Gadabunut, people of the Maar Nations as the original owners of the lands on which our library services operate, and we pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. We acknowledge and celebrate First Nations people of this land as the custodians of learning, literacy, knowledge and story. And I would like to acknowledge any First Nations people in the room here today, and also thank Karina Eccles, who was part of a session this morning, and thank her for her generosity of time, which is an enormous gift that she gives to us when she's so busy. I'm off script a bit now, but I'm wearing one of our purple t-shirts. This is one of our I'm with the band t-shirts that our staff actually designed. Yesterday was Wear Purple Day for, as an ally to support young LGBTQI+, our staff and our customers. And I just want to note that public libraries are a place where everyone is welcome. And unfortunately, as there are some extreme elements of our society that are becoming a bit more present in our libraries, just how we value our people. And I just wanted to note that today. You know, our t-shirt is all about books that have been banned, and we don't want to go there. So thank you to everyone who works with us and supports us. And today we are revealing the final results of the inaugural Local Word Poetry Prize. And this is a new prize offered by Geelong Regional Libraries and Deakin University, and launched at this year's World Poetry Day event in March, which was held here at Geelong Library. And I believe we may have one of the shortlisted entrants here this afternoon, who we might be calling up to the lectern in a moment to accept their prize. But for now, I'd like to introduce you to one of my fellow judges, himself a poet of very high regard, Professor David McCooey from the Faculty of Arts and Education, Deakin University. And David, just before you come up, just to share with everyone that David is the author of 4 previous collections of poetry, including Blister Pack, which won the Mary Gilmore Award and was shortlisted for 4 other major literary awards: Outside, which was shortlisted for the Queensland Literary Awards, and Starstruck. His poetry appeared in 10 of the last 11 editions of the Best Australian Poems series, and it has been widely anthologised nationally and internationally. David is the Deputy General Editor of the prize-winning Macquarie Pen Anthology of Australian Literature 2009. And David's 5th publication, The Book of Falling, was launched here last February. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much for that, Vanessa. That's very kind. I'm very happy to be here on behalf of the prize's main sponsor, Deakin University. The Local Word Poetry Prize is offered to emerging and established writers in poetry over the age of 16, Australia-wide. Entries of up to 75 lines were welcome, with 1 entry per person. And I'm very happy that in our inaugural year in offering this prize, we received a marvellous 360 entrants. So on behalf of the judging panel, I'd like to commend these poems as a group, all of them, which moved across a wide range of subjects, styles, forms and tones, from the traditional to the experimental, from the profoundly elegiac to the energetically comic. It was no small feat to judge this prize, as Vanessa will know. Vanessa and I met online with our 3rd judge, Geelong's Regional Library's virtual writer in residence and fellow poet, Louis Glazard, who is based in Manchester in the UK. And together we shortlisted a shortlist of 4 poems from a long list of 12. And I should point out that the judging panel, the process was completely anonymous. We didn't know who any of the poets were. So in alphabetical order, I will now announce the 3 commended entries, each of which will receive $250 prize money and publication on the Geelong Regional Library's website. So first up, congratulations to Carolyn Leach Paholski from Melbourne for her entry titled The Heart is an Only Child, which brings together plangency and wit in a moving meditation on loss and the consolatory powers of art. Congratulations, Carolyn. Carolyn, are you here? Yeah. Terrific. Just bear with us. Thank you. If there's no photo, it didn't happen. Second up, congratulations to Carla Porch from Brisbane for her entry titled Half a Brain, which is a kind of concrete poem which powerfully employs poetic form in its meditation of cognitive loss. Congratulations, Carla. Third up, congratulations to Katie Simmons from Melbourne for her poem David Hockney Dreamscape. Katie's poem is a witty homage to the English artist David Hockney, and like Hockney, Katie is a great stylist who is completely in touch with the sensuous power of colour. Congratulations, Katie. Unfortunately, Carla and Katie were unable to be here today, but the library will share the link to the recording of this event with them so that they can watch the announcement. Finally, I am very pleased to announce the winner of the inaugural Local Word Poetry Prize. The winner is Scott Patrick Mitchell from Perth, WA, for their entry, The Toy Ark. Scott Patrick is having a terrific year. In addition to winning this prize, they published their debut poetry collection, Clean, earlier this year, and that book has gone on to be shortlisted for 2 major literary awards. But back to their Local Word Prize-winning poem, The Toy Ark is a stunning prose poem that brings together the climate emergency with history, both ancient and modern, and in its attention to the sonic condition of poetry and its richly elusive texture, makes for a poem that gives up new riches with each successive reading. So, Scott Patrick receives the first prize money of $2,000, publication on the Geelong Regional Library's website, plus a 1-hour mentoring session with a Deakin University writing practitioner, as I was just saying in the green room. I don't think he really needs it, but if he wants it, he can have it. Unfortunately, but not surprisingly, given where he is, Scott Patrick was unable to join us here today from Perth. Not only is it long flight, but they're also competing in the Australian Poetry Slam today, and we wish them luck. So congratulations, Scott Patrick. And congratulations to everybody. Well done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, and congratulations to all the prize winners. And thank you, everyone, for being with us whilst we share those announcements. And I'm also very pleased to confirm that Deakin University has agreed to sponsor another year of both of our Local Word prizes. So I am announcing, get your pens out for the second annual Local Word Writing Prizes that will be announced shortly. Now, thank you for indulging us with those announcements, and over to you, Rhett. Rhett is the author of Hovering. I know you have to head off, David. Thank you for being with us. Rhett is the author of Hovering, which won the Victorian Premier's Literary Award for an unpublished manuscript in 2020 and was shortlisted for the Reading's New Australian Fiction Prize in 2022 and the I can't say it.
I don't know how to say that either. That's okay.
Aurealis Award for Science Fiction in 2023. He has an MFA in Creative Writing from the University of British Columbia and a PhD from Deakin. Rhett has lived in several places but always finds his way back to Geelong on Wadawurrung country, so he's the perfect choice to lead this discussion about living place, writing place. Thank you, Rhett.
Thanks, Vanessa. Brett and Red are kind of interchangeable. It's all good. It's all good. Exactly. Thank you, everybody, and thanks for joining us here today with these wonderful writers who I will introduce very shortly. I just wanted to say thank you for the acknowledgement of country there. I'd like to do a very quick reflection. I've lived in Geelong for most of my life. I was born up the road. And this bay, Corio Bay, has anyone actually sat and watched the dolphins at all that have come in from time to time? Has anyone seen dolphins on Corio Bay at all? It's something that as someone who lived on the waterfront for a while and has walked past, I've often, on certain days, so usually calm summer days, you can kind of see them there. Sometimes I've even caught them swimming with actual people and brushing up against them. It's kind of weird. And I've always wondered why they would bother being here. They've got a whole ocean out there. It's really lovely. Why Corio Bay? And a few years ago, I read Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu, and it kind of hit me like a bit of a truck. In it, he talks about Foster Fynes, who was a local sort of settler, for those who don't know, and who observed Wadawurrung people actually working with the dolphins to herd fish here. And it happened all over Australia, obviously, but I just always like to kind of have a little bit of what happened here? What have we kind of lost, and maybe what these dolphins might be sort of, in a strange way, kind of remembering. As a bit of a way of introducing us to this place, Wadawurrung country that we're on. But let's just get on to our wonderful panellists that we've got here today. Tom Molyneux, first of all, over to that side of me. Tom is a Gunditj Mara theatre actor, director and playwright based on Wadawurrung country in Geelong. He has an extensive history of work in successful independent and touring theatre productions, including as an actor, writer and director in Stardust and The Mission, which extensively toured regional Victoria in 2019 to great acclaim, and subsequently toured to over 35 venues nationally around Australia in 2022. He received a 2023 Green Room Award as Best Performer Independent Theatre for his performance in The Mission. Thanks, Tom. And Dorothy Johnson, in the middle there, was born in Geelong and now lives in Ocean Grove. Dorothy is the author of 13 novels and is currently working on a Sea Change mystery series set in Queenscliff. She's the author of a quartet of crime novels set in Canberra, where she lived for many years. Two of her novels, literary novels, one for The Master, which we'll be talking about today a little bit, and Ruth, have been shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Award. One for The Master has recently been republished as part of the Untapped project. Dorothy has published many short stories in journals and anthologies, along with essays in Australia's major newspapers and journals. Thanks for being here, Dorothy. And lastly, here we have Kchak Akech, is a South Sudanese writer, performing artist, storyteller and a lover of words, living and working on Wadawurrung country. Since the moment she learned to write English at the age of 6, Kchak has been writing out the stories that live inside her mind. As a migrant and non-native English speaker, she's fascinated by the unspoken words and unsung songs of the day-to-day. She finds herself drawn to stories that challenge perception and go against the grain of the expected, while also being grounded in truth. Her debut novel, Hopeless Kingdom, inspired by her own journey of migrating to Australia, explores the relationship of a mother and daughter as they settle, break, evolve and adapt in new lands through multiple heartaches and triumphs. It was also shortlisted for the Miles Franklin this year, which is actually a massive thing for a debut author in particular, so congratulations to you all, really. I can't understate how big that is. It's a massive thing, so well done. So we're going to just do a little, each of these writers and performers has a different sort of relationship with the general Geelong area, but we'll be talking about place and how we write about place generally. I'm just going to talk to Tom first. We'll go a little bit through and a bit of the work that you've been doing. So Tom.
Rhett.
Hello.
Hello.
It's a long way away. It feels like a long way away, but it's okay.
Little silhouette down there at the end.
You've written and performed very movingly about your great-great-uncle Alan MacDonald, Gunditj Mara man. He was, I believe, one of the first Aboriginal soldiers from Victoria who enlisted in World War I, but was treated as a second-class citizen or whatever on his return to Australia. Can you introduce the play to us a little bit and maybe give a bit of a background to it?
For sure. First of all, thank you, and thank you for the acknowledgements that have happened so far, and I echo that. I want to acknowledge Wadawurrung traditional custodians, elders, ancestors, for allowing us to gather on their country. And as a visitor to this place, I bring the compliments of my ancestors with me, Gunditjmara ancestors, and I'll talk more about Uncle Alan in a second. But I just can't help. My chair is oriented straight towards Wurdi Youang out these windows, and it's been really nice sitting here just in the shadow of that place. I think what we're doing today is connected to a long line of coming together in a place just like that and sharing story and sharing knowledge and hopefully walking away enriched. And also just to reflect on Kashak's experience as well. I first met Kashak just across the road at Platform Arts when it used to be Courthouse Youth Arts, and to see your journey, Kashak, from working in that place and growing yourself as a writer and artist to sitting here being a nominee for Miles Franklin. I mean, that's unbelievable. So it's just very cool, this sort of little ecosystem and this place in Geelong and what's happened creatively over a short time. But look, on the mission, yes, it's a play about Uncle Alan, about his life story, but it's also a lot more than that. He's the linchpin of the story, but it tells the story of frontier injustices against Gunditjmara people generally, and what happened with those original dispossessions down at southwest Victoria, sort of from Portland across. And we've sort of focused through him and his ancestors as well on how that journey has been trod by many people. Uncle Alan was, along with some of his cousins, the Lovett brothers and his brother as well, among the first Aboriginal men from Victoria to enlist for World War I, and it was actually illegal for them to do that at the time. To enlist in the AIF, you had to be substantially of European origin, was the term that they used, and so I suppose in some ways you could consider them fortunate to be able to slip through that net, which was essentially a colour grading net, looking at skin colour, and if you could convince people that you looked somewhat Italian or insert European ancestry here, then they were willing to turn a bit of a blind eye. But there were many of his cousins as well that were denied that opportunity to go and serve. And the interesting thing for that experience through the research that we've done and the people that we've spoken to was that for a lot of the Aboriginal servicemen in World War I, it was the first time that the racism kind of disappeared into the background. And they figured out pretty quickly that they had to have each other's back, had to serve as brothers, whether they were Indigenous or non-Indigenous. And it was the first example of equal pay, one of the very first examples of equal pay for Aboriginal people in this country, and so on and so forth. So being away was actually a really interesting thing. Whilst lives were on the line and there was obviously the horror and desperation of war, for those that returned, it was interesting that in some ways the horror continued here. And the Lake Conda Mission, where they returned to, was closed down shortly after World War I ended. And so this idea of them coming back to a place that they were inherently attached to, connected to for thousands and thousands of years with custom and culture and tradition, but a place that was carved up, removed, their access was denied. And mind you, this was the mission. This was already a highly controlled environment. So yes, for Uncle Alan, that was a really difficult experience, and his contemporaries too. And what happened from there was obviously a really interesting journey also, and the milestones that he lived through in his life in contemporary Australian history. He died only a few weeks after the 1967 referendum. And obviously it's kind of interesting having some of the conversations that we're having this year, thinking about him and his experience. He was someone that he only just saw the success of that referendum, but wasn't able to benefit from what it brought with it. And so he was in an unmarked grave in the Warrnambool Cemetery for 54 years until we marked his grave a bit over a year ago. So the play, whilst it tells his story, was obviously a lot more than just a play. It was an example of throwing stone in the pond and watching the ripple go out, and,
Yeah.
and what that did for communities, for our family, for Uncle Alan, you know, and his memory and legacy was really powerful.
Mm. What brought you to this story in particular? I mean, obviously it's a pretty strong family story, but what made you sort of want to really explore it in this way?
It's interesting. I was doing some family history research with Dad, and who's here today, and we came across his story. One of our aunties had written it down, just a snippet, just a tiny little fragment of a story that she had been told by him about his experience in Palestine, and he was part of the Light Horse. It was this. They were out on patrol, and he was doing some scouting ahead of the rest of them. And when he turned around and came back, they'd all been killed by Turkish snipers. It would appear from the story, and his view of it was that they'd left him alive because he had dark skin, and that he might have been a Turk, a captured Turk working for them or something. So they decided not to kill him, even though he believed they had the opportunity to do so. And so, obviously, the racial politics of that are pretty astounding, but also the story, regardless, is just unbelievable of coming so close to death and what that would have meant for Uncle Alan. And so that was the kernel, if you will. And from there, the process really became one of going, I wonder what else is out there. You know, it's such a fascinating little tidbit. I had to kind of keep scratching the surface, and we went and talked to other family members, elders, other community members who knew Uncle Alan or knew of him or knew of his family. And bit by bit, we started to uncover more of these really interesting strands of the story. And obviously, with the military side of it, there is some really great record keeping up at the War Memorial in Canberra and other places, Public Records Office. So it became a process of discovery. What could we find? And then we had a whole lot of disparate pieces of source material, and then it became, how do we weave this together to form a piece of truth-telling? At its core, I wanted it to be about memorial and legacy, and how do we do remembering in this country? How are we selective in that process about what we remember? But also to make something dramatically that would really convey the emotion of Uncle Alan's journey and the different trials that he experienced. So, then we set about doing that, and the play went through a couple of early iterations, developments and showings, and then we took it on tour and around different Victorian communities to start with, and then nationally. And as we did that, you know, we sort of kept getting that reinforcement that people really appreciated hearing about Uncle Alan's journey, and one that they wished they'd heard of sooner.
And navigating all the different COVID restrictions at the time too, which was, as we talked about before, was quite a
I have to acknowledge
difficult
my husband down there in the front row, Joel, who produced the tour and did so much for the tour. He was the brain behind it all that kept the show on the road, even when everything looked like it was going to take it off the road. So, it was a massive journey.
We will probably have a chance to mention the Geelong Arts Centre at some point. In this is it's a fascinating and fantastic sort of building that's just been redeveloped there. As you mentioned that Alan grew up on the Lake Condomission on the Budj Bim landscape. As a Gunditj Murra man yourself, can you talk a little bit about that region, the Budj Bim landscape and its importance to the Gunditj Murra people?
Yeah, well, the play actually starts there. It starts with one of our Gunditj Murra dreaming stories about the formation of the landscape 30,000 years ago. The volcanic eruptions through southwest Victoria. Obviously, it's a very volcanic landscape for those of you that are familiar. And what our ancestors did to set up some of the oldest aquaculture systems in the world starts there. It starts with the landscape being shifted and transformed through Budj Bim and his eruption. And the story goes that he's sort of this giant who rose out of the earth and got overheated and was spitting his teeth, which were the chunks of scoria, over the landscape. And he was so hot that he had to essentially, drag himself down to the ocean to cool off, and that left all of these lava tubes behind him as he dragged his feet down towards the ocean. And as he came back and laid down, and so what you can see now is his forehead. It's Wujibim literally translates to high forehead. And so that's him lying down in the landscape. And so everything from there became possible. All of the aquaculture, the way that wetland was deliberately, what's the word I'm looking for? Transformed. So they created pools and ponds to use the eels that have their fabulous migration down the southern coast of Australia, and all of that's part of our journey as Gunditjmara people. The landscape is inextricably linked with what's possible and what you do as an individual, and how country sustains you. So it's great to get down there. A hugely important part of writing this play was going down and spending time there and listening, both to the landscape but also just to people, who talked about, generally speaking, the landscape and what it meant to them. And so when you go through the writing process, you're trying to capture all of that, all of those inputs, the feelings, the emotions, and then the drama of the story as well. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Dorothy, we'll move over to you for a bit. We'll come back to Tom in a minute. You have many books that we could talk about. You've 13. I think we've talked about I think the first book you published was in 1984.
84.
84. We're going to focus on the Geelong-based one for the Masters today, which is mostly set. Well, it's set all over Geelong, really. In the 50s, it's actually throughout the 20th century a little bit, isn't it? Would you be able to just introduce the novel to us briefly, if you can kind of give us a bit of a background of what the novel was about?
Yeah, One for the Masters about the collapse of the woolen industry in Geelong. It's set in a fictional mill on the Barwon. And when I was growing up, I lived not very far from the river, and my sister and I used to play down there, and it was very boggy and marshy and wild. And my daughter's here in the audience. When my daughter was a toddler, a baby, I came down to stay with my parents one time, and I was walking her in her pram along on a path along the Barwon, and there was a mist. And the ruins of the old mills there were growing out of the mist. And when I went home, I said to Dad, what's going on here, Why are they just ruins? And we had a bit of a chat about it, and one of my aunts had worked in a woolen mill, but she didn't want to talk to me that much about it, but my dad had lived in Geelong all his life, and he put me in touch with quite a lot of people who had worked in the mills. And so I started talking to them, and then the National Wool Museum opened, and that was a wonderful resource for me. And I started putting together a story about the people and about how the woolen industry collapsed. So that's One for the Master. But I'll just have a short digression from that.
Please, yeah.
Because on this notion of place, I'm very keen on naming places. Geelong's Geelong, Queenscliff. When I moved to Canberra at the end of the 1970s, there'd been very, very little fiction set in Canberra. Poets, yes, there had been, but very little fiction. And I helped to form a writers' group. And we said we were fiction writers, and we put together an anthology, which Penguin was going to publish. Now, our anthology was called Canberra Tales, but Penguin wouldn't have a bar of that title. They hated it. They said any title with that includes the word Canberra is the kiss of death. We'll be giving it the kiss of death. But we liked Canberra Tales because it had sort of echoes of Chaucer, who was a civil servant after all. So we fought tooth and nail and we got our Canberra Tales title. But then, a few years later, when the novel was reprinted, it was reprinted as The Division of Love, which is an anodyne nothing title. But that's a little anecdote to illustrate how important it was for us. We were called Seven Writers, and important for us to say, yes, we are creative people, and you might laugh at that notion, but we are creative people who live in this place. And we're going to use it in the title of our story. So that's just a short digression on the importance, perhaps, of naming places and of pushing against the current prejudice, whatever that happens to be. You couldn't. I mean, it's absurd to think of that now, but in the early 80s, it wasn't absurd. You know, those prejudices were very, very real.
Well, even writing about, I mean, and reading a bit about a place like Geelong is a little bit, you know, it's rare to read about this city. I mean, we've got the big one up the road. That's where all the stuff happens,
Yeah, well,
right?
the cultural cringe moves.
Yeah.
You know, and it does.
Yeah.
And for a long time, you could only ever set a crime novel in New York or Los Angeles.
Yeah.
You know, you get the idea of setting one in Australia was ridiculous. but those sort of prejudices have been watered down. But yes, like you're exactly right. You have to fight for the right to say what you want to say about the place you want to write about.
Yeah, it's interesting. My first, I hadn't read anything about Geelong ever, pretty much, despite being fairly well read, until I read, I think it was Peter Carey's Illywhacker, was the first time, and it's not all that complimentary of Geelong, but that's fine. You know, Geelong was Geelong. But it is so important to sort of have actual art and literature, isn't it, about the place, exploring what it means to be part of
I believe so.
this place. Yeah. And we talked a little bit earlier about I tend to sort of when I write, I tend to sort of disguise what I'm writing about. I don't think the three of you really do that. It's very much just this is where it is, okay. So whereas I'm a bit more like, maybe I'll call it something else. I'll have to think about that, I think.
But the other thing is that you have to actually feel it. You know, I mean, what I've just said you might think is a sort of abstract intellectual exercise. Not at all. I mean, you have to feel it in your bones. The place you're writing about. That's a cliche. I mean, it's sort of obvious, but you might not necessarily know that when you start writing about a certain place. But if it feels like, you know, if it feels right, and the feeling is there in your bones, then you sort of know you're on the right track. That's my idea of it.
I walked down Finesford this morning, actually, just as it seemed right to sort of walk around there a little bit this morning. How much has it changed around in those places in the last sort of? I mean, because this was One for the Master was published in about 1990.
It was published
early
in
1990s.
In 96, so it's not that old. But the Geelong, can I read a little bit in a minute, just from the start?
Absolutely, go for it.
But I'll just, well, it's obviously changed a huge amount. I mean, the marshy, swampy places where my sister and I played. And by the way, our parents it wouldn't have occurred to them that they had to come with us. That's no longer exists. Of course, it no longer exists.
Would you like to do a quick reading for us?
I might do that.
Yeah,
I'll
just to
read
give us
the
a bit
very
of
beginning.
a bit of a sense of all the different. I mean, it really is it's a book with so much of Geelong in there, and that was what was really delightful for me as a Geelong person. That's something I want to talk about generally too. Is that how much, if you're from a place, how much does that bring as a reader to some of your work? But anyway, we'll do a quick reading, Dorothy.
Before I do that, I just want to say thank you to the Untapped Project, which is a wonderful project about republishing out-of-print Australian titles. And this new edition wouldn't exist were it not for the Untapped Project. And also to say a very big thank you to the libraries, because state and territory libraries' funding made the Untapped Project possible.
Wonderful.
So this is from the very beginning of the novel. Geelong, 1996. Ghosts form in the damp air above the banks of the Barwon River. I meet them there at dusk, when they take shape out of the yellow mist that hangs over what used to be Highlands Woolen Mill. Though the mist is always present, it often drifts into tatters and reforms. This is the time for ghosts. The Barwon is not a big river, except when it's in flood. I sit by it in the evenings until dark, sometimes late into the night. I listen to the ghosts and they tell me their stories. Behind me are the shells of huge buildings, which no river mist can hide. The air itself seems to stand in awe of them. Once they were woolen mills, noisy and dirty, bumptious and solid as rocks. Their boilers spitting out steam, their dye vats a poisonous rainbow-coloured cocktail. It is one of life's small ironies that land along the river now is worth so little that no one has bothered to pull the mills down and build something else in their place. Highlands, 1961. I started work in the middle of a heat wave. I walked to Highlands Mill along the river path, a path as familiar to me as the back garden of my house, as the house that had been left to my uncle when my grandparents died. Squatting on the river was a glum, sleeping mist, nothing like the grey mists of winter, but yellow, seeming to hold the coming heat of the day within it. I stopped and turned to face the houses that backed onto the river, then quickly flicked my head around to trick the mist into disappearing, but it stayed stuck to the river as though the two were partners. I thought of a picture of Mr. Wind in a book my uncle used to read to me, Mr. Wind with his cheeks full of air ready to blow it out, and the way my uncle copied him, puffing out his cheeks, the way his fair skin stretched, how soft his face was. I started walking again, more slowly this time, under the last of the gum trees. Ahead of me, across a dry grass common and a road, were the mill's black ram's head gates. 3 boys were pushing their bikes through the gates. I knew one of them from school and was glad they didn't turn and see me. The wrought iron gates, twice my height, were already warm and slippery from the sun. I reached up and ran a cautious finger around the bottom of the old-fashioned lettering, Highlands, 1887, and the halls and curves that were 2 huge horns dwarfing the body of the ram beneath them. A group of girls in flowered dresses pushed past me on the gravel driveway. They all seemed to be carrying large handbags and wearing black high heels. I knew that when the whistle went, I was expected to be in the weaving shed. I could not have said why I dawdled and held back. The driveway led straight to the main tower building, which was tall and square, made of locally quarried bluestone. Around it were a number of single-storey wooden sheds. From the front, looking up from the riverside, as I was, the tower looked rather like a castle. It stood as high as the cliffs it was made from, and it wasn't hard to imagine it lasting for 800 years, the way castles had in Scotland. So that's the beginning of the novel.
Lovely.
Of course it did. Of course it didn't last
No.
anywhere near 800 years.
But there are some amazing sort of viewpoints of it along the river there still, and that's something that's it's quite extraordinary. Thank you, Dorothy. We'll go over to Chuck now. Now, your book, Hopeless Kingdom, which is an incredible novel, actually, about a family who leaves Africa for Australia and eventually this place. Could you give us a quick introduction to the book and maybe its main characters a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So the book Hopeless Kingdom is about a mother, her name is Tarasai, and her daughter Akira. At the start of the book, they've fled Sudan and they're living in Egypt. And the point where the book sort of takes a turn is when they decide to relocate to Australia. And I want to say that maybe 90% of the front end of the book is based on true events that actually happened in my life, including some of the scarier ones for any of you that have read it. But yeah, it was heavily inspired by my own journey of migration, by my mother's journey of migration, by my family's journey of migration. And I just wanted to, at first, it didn't start out as this idea that, okay, I'm going to write a book about the story of my life. It was more just, I was playing around with the idea of home and what that means to me, as a migrant who came to Australia very young, and also having to grow up in Australia. And there's this really weird thing that happens when migrants move over to Australia. Me being really young, I'm not even sure if I'd class myself as a first generation Australian, but I think I am. as I was growing up in Australia, there was this sort of gap that started to form between my mother and myself and my father and myself, you know, the generation before us and us kids. Because as we were growing up, we were becoming Australian. We were like the kids in school. We wanted to eat the same food they were eating, wanted to wear the same clothes they were wearing, we wanted to play the same sport, do the same things that they were doing. And of course, mum and dad were they encouraged us to do that. That's why we came to this country. But they were holding on to their old traditional ways of doing things. And so there were so many times and so many instances growing up where it was like, where do you finding myself and finding my identity, and just figuring out what that word means was something that I think was more complex because, you know, you can't really go to your mum and ask her this question or that question, because her life when she was your age is so totally different to the life that you're living now. So you can't go to her for counsel, or to your dad, or to your siblings, because they're going through the exact same thing. So with Hopeless Kingdom, it started out as me just sort of documenting all the things that I'd gone through, just to sort of get out all this. I was going through an existential crisis, pretty much. And yeah, it started out as this thing where I was just getting my thoughts out into the page, just so I can understand myself and understand my place in this world and in this country and in Geelong. And yeah, just figuring out what that word home means, because I think it wasn't until I was about 22, 23, I'm 26 now. It wasn't until then that I was like, okay, Geelong is my home, and there's nowhere else in the world that I feel about like I do this place. Yeah.
It's an interesting idea, just to how much of writing about place is about belonging in so many ways, right? In almost universal ways. But you talk about in the book itself, you've got Akita, who's the younger, one of the younger daughters, and the mother Tarasai.
Yes.
So how was it to write both of those perspectives? Because obviously you might have had a bit of more of an understanding of Akita, perhaps.
Yeah.
How was it to write the mother's perspective?
It was really interesting, and I actually had a lot of fun doing it. When I sort of was getting to a place where I was like, okay, this is a story that I'm writing that is probably going to turn into a very, very lengthy one. One of the first things that I decided was I wanted to sort of write from the perspective of the mother and the daughter, because I was 23 at the time. I was living at home, and we were like a week into lockdown in March of 2020. And so this thing was happening in my life. My relationship with mum was sort of getting to this place where, as I was growing into a young woman, I wasn't a girl anymore. Her and I started seeing each other as equals. And when our relationship reached that place, I started thinking about what she was like as a girl, what her life was like. I never once thought about what moving to Australia was like for her. I never thought about, all those kind of things. She didn't know English. There were 7 of us, I think, when we came to Australia. Dad was the only one that knew English, and we obviously adapted to Australia very well, being young kids. I learned English in less than a year. Within 8 months, I was learning how to write my name and all that kind of stuff. And so that was the first time that I stopped to think what that move was like for my mum, and what it was like, till this day. And so that was how the character of Tarasai sort of came out. And when there were times where I was lost, and there was a lot, writing this book and sort of forming Tarasai's voice, I would go to my mum and I'd ask her all the questions that I had in my mind. And from her answers, I'd sort of come away with it and be like, I'd learn more about her, but I'd also sort of, use what I've learned, with her permission, of course, and just infuse it in this character of Tarasai. And I think doing that in real life has enriched our relationship to a point where I don't know if, would be at this point if I didn't just take a moment 3 years ago to stop and wonder what my mother was like as a girl. Yeah.
It's really wonderful. I mean, so many times writers burn bridges when they're writing characters, right? So it's lovely to see it the other way around, where you're actually exploring sort of an actual the sort of that empathy of reaching out to your mother and kind of trying to understand that what it must have been like. And it's such a it's fascinating to me how believable of a voice it is in the book. It's such a, it must have been a difficult thing to do. So well done.
Yeah, thank you.
So the family winds up in Norlane, in fact, I
Yes.
think, and the reader gets a very strong sense of the suburb,
Yes.
particularly when Arquita starts to sneak out late at night.
Yeah.
How did Corio and Norlane influence the work? Did you want to talk a little bit about those
sure.
specific places?
So when we first came to Australia, we lived in Sydney for a few years. We lived in Sydney from 2003, and then 2006 we moved to Geelong because my mother's family lived in Geelong, and we moved here to be closer to them. And when we lived in Sydney, we lived in this suburb in this town called Auburn. I don't know if you guys know about Auburn, but it's very multicultural. And moving from Egypt to Auburn, that transition for me as a child was so seamless because I was going to school and there were a ton of other kids in class that looked like me and 20 other kids that spoke Arabic and could translate and can act as, interpreters between me and my teacher. So that was the coolest thing ever, and it actually sped up the process of us learning English, I think. And then when we packed up all the friends that, we packed up all the memories we made in Sydney, the home that we made there, and moved to Geelong, that was so jarring just because, I don't know if you guys know, but Geelong in 2006 was not multicultural at all.
I think that's a fair comment.
Yeah. I went to my primary school was St. Francis Xavier, and actually ran into one of my old teachers from St. Francis Xavier today. Hi, Miss Pradich. In 2006, St. Francis Xavier, Corio. We lived in Corio. There's a part in the book where Akita's walking through the school with her brother and her sister, and the principal goes, "You guys are the first African family to attend this school," and that is the truth. We were the first African family to attend St. Francis Xavier. And I was feeling very, very conflicted. I was so nervous. And then, of course, going to school and stuff like that, it was the first real time that I experienced racism because, there were so many white people, which of course isn't a problem, but me being black and my siblings being black, we were made the problem because of it. My older brother and my younger sister didn't really struggle as much with that because they were way more extroverted, and I guess they were cool, and it's easy to see past blackness when the black person is cool, but I was not cool. I was the biggest dork ever, and so finding friends was really, really hard for me. And making them. And so, I struggled for a long time with my relationship with Geelong because I'm like, people here don't want me here, don't like me around, so why would I, like this place? But eventually things started getting easier. I went to Clonard College from year 7 to 12, so 2009 to 2014. And Clonard is a brilliant school. It's a great school, but I was still living in Corio and in Norlane, and those suburbs don't get the best reputation. They don't have the best reputation. And I had a lot of shame whilst going to Clonard and catching the number 10 bus to take me to Roseville to go home. I had a lot of shame in saying where I lived because it was on the poorer side of town. I had a lot of shame in, telling my friends to come over to my place because there was a stabbing on my street last week, which, to be fair, is fair. But I just had a lot of shame around Corio Norlane, where I came from. But as I sort of got older and got into university, that somehow, and I don't know how, it sort of turned into pride. Happily started repping where I was from. What were you going to say? Sorry?
Oh, I didn't want to interrupt you. I was just happy listening to you. But but you can really feel that coming through with Arquita in particular in the novel, in the sense that there's this. I don't want to kind of give too much away about it, but it is that sense of. From going from Sydney to Geelong is a very clear kind of shock to the system for her, but there is a sense that as she gets older, there is a pride coming in, and it's quite beautiful.
Thank you.
The family goes through an enormous amount of hardship, but the title "Hopeless Kingdom" is a wonderful title, but it's and this could be the point, but it actually feels like quite a hopeful novel. Would you agree?
Yeah.
Okay, good. That was
Definitely,
the point.
yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Can you just tell me a bit about that? Was that what you intended to sort of be a bit of a hopeful story about family?
Yeah,
at some
yeah. I
level?
mean, 100%. I had a lot of fun writing Hopeless Kingdom, and my relationship, as I said before, with my mother, we got so much closer, and we're still really close. But with my sisters as well, with my brothers, and just like unpacking a lot of our memories and our trauma was something that was shared. So it lightened the load when it came to me in writing this book, and I just felt very blessed to be the person to hold the torch and carry the torch and then eventually pass it on. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. What was the question?
I don't.
Hopeless Kingdom.
Well, it was about hope. Was it
Yeah.
written from a point of hope?
Because that's what I was feeling, a lot of that while I was writing the book and holding on to it in the difficult chapters that I had to write as well. And also, there's a point in the book, Akita's 6 at the side of the book, the daughter, and by the end she's in her early 20s. And her and her mother sort of reached this point, this tension in their relationship where they're just not seeing eye to eye at all. And it's sort of based on what I was saying before with when you have children that grow up in Australia, but your home is still Sudan or wherever else. I sort of explore that a lot, and one of the only shared feelings that they have is just this feeling of hopelessness and being so lost, and neither one of them can see each other's pain, even though it's the same pain. So that as well.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chuck. So we'll talk a bit about just general some questions now. I'm actually interested in that kind of idea of belonging to start with, because I think that's you made a really good point. I mean, in the sense of how much of when we write about a specific place is about how we as writers maybe feel like we belong to the place, how our characters belong to the place. How much is it about actual belonging? Anyone can go in.
I think it's a great question. I think the people of a place inherently influence the place and how you talk about it and how it feels and how you describe it. But additionally, place has its own sentiment too, and it belongs in a way that people don't. And I think one of the tensions with politics in this country comes from that sort of originating difference of perspective on, does the place belong to us or do we belong to the place? And it's certainly something that I've tried to explore a little bit in the art that I've made and the pieces that I have written. But this idea that, the original dispossession just comes from a fundamental different way of viewing the country. As a thing to be owned, as a thing where fences can be put up and suddenly it has a different sense of who it belongs to and what its purpose is, and that just being fundamentally at odds with how this place was viewed for tens of thousands of years. To set up a refinery right next to Wurdi Youang, it's this sort of weird confluence of things that are really antithetical to each other, and certainly that was the case for us down on Gunitj Mara country, and this it's strange to go down there and feel that sense of belonging, but so much has changed to it irrevocably. So yeah, it's kind of hard to reconcile sometimes, that sense of belonging.
What about you, Dorothy? I mean, in One for the Master, you talked about, it's quite a class-based sort of novel in lots of ways. You're talking a lot about mill workers and the idea
characters.
that there was a lot of workers' rights kind of things going on at the time. How much of their kind of story was about kind of what they're allowed to sort of be able to do, how they're allowed to work and belong to a place?
Yeah, well, I mean, Geelong's got a very rich history of trade unionism, of fighting for the 8-hour day. It's got a very rich history of this connected with the suffragist movement, and it was known as the Bradford of the South. It was an industrial city. I mean, and that disappeared. So my characters feel that disappearance. They're part of it. That's the story I'm telling.
It's actually actively happening and then they start off towards the end of really that mill cycle. Was it the 60s that it really sort of wrapped up there?
Well, it was the 70s.
70s, was it? Okay.
The tariff cuts of the 70s were sort of the end, but there were lots of changes that meant that. But yeah, so I wanted to tell the story about those sorts of people. Now I have a sort of a bit of a conflicted relationship with those sorts of people. My father was a motor mechanic and he worked for the Country Roads Board, and but I got educated out of the working class, which was a huge aim that my parents wanted me and my sister to be educated out of the working class, and they succeeded, but it was hard. No one in my family had ever finished secondary school, let alone gone to university. So that is always a conflict, I think, for people who become artists of any kind.
Mm-hmm.
You go back and you try and you do have a very conflicted relationship, I think.
So I'm just to sort of go off on a little tangent here. We've got playwrights and novelists here. And this is where I start to get a bit curious because I'm more of a novelist. Obviously, I'm curious I'm curious in how we all think about place when we're writing, right?
Yeah.
And playwrights obviously think about place quite differently than novelists. But I'm curious as to, Tom, how you think about place when you're actually writing, and how you because obviously you've got sort of things like cost. You've got sets to think about. You've got actual.
No,
how
that's someone else's problem.
Maybe that could be. I don't know.
Yeah. No, you write it in the most fantastic way possible.
And then
fabulous,
it can just change.
all the additional things, and then the producer comes along. We can't afford that. Pare it down.
Is that how it works? I guess.
Look, no, not always. In fact, with this play, it was very deliberate from the very start that it would be incredibly sparse. And that there would be essentially nothing on the stage. So all of the world building in this play actually happens through the text, it's just one actor on stage building the world so that people in the audience can see it with no assistance. And so it's incredibly reliant on the text and the action, and so it becomes a real conversation between the actor and director about how to realise the spatial environment you're trying to create, whether that is the interior of a pub or whether it's sitting at the foot of Budjabim looking up at a mountain, and you can do that in many different ways through your body. And I think once you've been that actor building that world, it sort of changes the way that you do write things, because you realise some of it you can rely on your body for. You don't have to tell people absolutely everything, and so it becomes more of a conversation between body and music and text, rather than having to be solely reliant on the page to do all the work.
And for me, I'm as I said, I have no talent in that space whatsoever. But I think as novelists, I've learned that to actually perform at some level what you're writing, even if it's just to read it out loud, it gives it some level of reality that you don't normally see, and you can sort of see it from a different lens. How do either of you kind of read your work out loud in a performance sense to sort of get a sense of what you're writing about?
Well, I read it out loud if I'm practicing.
So you did a few practices before today, perhaps.
But look, normally I don't read out loud to myself. I'd probably horrify myself if I read early drafts.
How about you, Jack? Do you do any sort of level of of reading your work to sort of get a bit of a different...
Out loud?
Out loud, yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Only to say my sisters or my friends or my partner, just to see if what I've put on the page makes sense or if it reads well. But other than that, I don't think so.
Why I'm asking is I think the novelists get very internal, obviously. And sometimes when we kind of read out loud, that internal lens sort of gets stripped away a little bit. And when we're talking about plays, I often I sort of tend to sort of go on lots of long walks, for example, to sort of really get a sense of the place. How do you build your settings, I guess, when you're thinking about it? Now, Chuck, in Hopeless Kingdom, places there. It's not necessarily everything. I think
Yep.
probably the strongest sense of place that I got from that was in Norlane
Yes.
and in particular.
Yeah.
How did you build that? Do you go to the place to sort of get an idea of it? What do you do?
Yeah. So I was living in Norlane, in my family home when I was writing Hopeless Kingdom, and at that point we'd been living in Norlane, I think, for over 10 years. So there was this like established relationship, and I had grown such a fondness of Norlane, and it'd been a place where Cryo and Norlane, it'd been a place where, for me that was where my home base is. No matter like where I went in the country and in the world, I knew that's where, in my heart, that's where home is, and I was always sort of led to it. So when I was writing Hopeless Kingdom, it was very easy for me to sort of pull from the little sparkles that make Norlane and Corayo, and sort of just put it onto the page and sort of allow it to feel authentic, because it was. But all of the other places, like say in Egypt or in Sydney, I was heavily relying on my memories of those places. And just tapped into my pool of memories and pulled what I can out, and obviously embellished some. But
Go on, Dorothy.
Can I say a word about my
please.
Queenscliff mysteries?
Please.
There's 4 Queenscliffs. The first one starts with the theft of a camel. And people ask me, they say, where was the camel? Where was the paddock the camel was stolen from? And I make up, I look at them and I think, well, but there was actually a camel stolen, not from Queenscliff, but from Point Lonsdale, which is very close by, was stolen from a circus. So, but it's funny what people want you to tell them. And it's,
So do you when you're writing about camels and so forth? I think what I've noticed with your novels is you've gone from you have Canberra, you have Queenscliff, you have Geelong, you've got actual really well researched sort of spaces. How do you do a lot of research whenever you write a novel about the place itself? Do you get in there and sort of just
No. In the end, I probably end up with quite a lot of research, but I tend to do it quite late because I want to write my story.
It's the story first before the
and
research.
And then I want to find out if it's plausible. But I did do some. I mean, the Queenscliff, I do these literary tours of Queenscliff when they go around all the sites of my four books, and they include the police station, which there's nobody physically there in the police station. But when I started, there was, and I went to see the sergeant who was there, and he was a bit of, he gave me this look of, funny old literary novelist, lady novelist coming to ask some questions, but he was quite polite, and he answered them all, and so on and so forth, but then what happened was, the next time I bumped into him, he was running a vegan restaurant in Geelong. And I thought, well, okay, if that can happen, what's wrong with me making stuff up?
Absolutely.
That's a true story.
Absolutely. I believe you. That's wonderful. How does where you're living impact your writing? Anyone can jump in on this one.
I was actually just going to throw something in on the last question, Rhett,
Go
if
for
I
it,
may.
yeah.
This idea of, so many of the places I was writing about in the play, they either don't exist anymore or they don't exist in the way that they were in the time of the play. So the mission, you go down there to the Lake Condah Mission, there's a couple of wrecks of old stone dwellings remaining, and that's it. And all of the other weatherboard houses have been pulled down. There was a church, which is a very central location in the play, that is completely non-existent. It was dynamited and pulled apart. And so that world-building element is really crucial, and it's one of the reasons why we had the stage bare, was because it doesn't exist, actually, in real life. So building it for people is the same as building it for yourself. It all comes from a place of supposition, memory, your best guess, all this. There's some photos and that sort of stuff, but it really lives in people's heads more than it lives in real life. And so you're trying to tease that out, what is that feeling of it, rather than anything that truly exists. And one of the best things that we did with the play, Joel was able to connect with Nadia Nordhaus, who's an amazing Australian brass musician who lives in New York. But she was willing to compose some new works for us in the play. And one of the things we did was we went down to Lake Condah and recorded, just on my phone, some of the sounds of the lake, whether that was frogs croaking or birds chirping or water trickling, and whatever was in that soundtrack, that was the place that she started with for this brand new piece of brass music that was also trying to evoke some of that, feeling of being at war and being displaced, and this feeling of disconnection from place coming from connection to place, literally from the foundation of place. And so to get to that sort of musical outcome from just sounds of country was a wonderful and for her lens to sort of reflect back. I gave her very little, sort of the sound and some description of colours and what it feels like to be down there, about one page. And from that she was able to create this whole song.
Wonderful.
Yeah, unbelievable to kind of
Yeah.
see that from another artist or musician put back at you.
It's this sort of sense of, I'm fascinated by what you're talking about there with the sense of there's memory in there, but there's sort of a mystical kind of like longer term memory as well, a sort of ancestral memory perhaps, and other bits and pieces coming into it. Just even the animals and there's so much more to it than just memory. But Jack, you talked a bit about memory in terms of how you had to write about kind of Cairo, in particular, I think. How much of writing about these places is about memory versus what is actually there? Like, how much do we can't obviously write about places truly accurately. It's really always about a perception, right?
Yeah.
How close do you like to get? Do you want to be completely accurate, or do you want to be kind of a bit?
Well, when I was sort of constructing the voice of Akita in the earlier chapters, I wanted it to feel authentic, but at the same time, I wanted it to be fun, and I had a lot of fun writing the earlier scenes of Akita, and all the stuff all the trouble that her and her brother got up to, because like I said before, a lot of it was based on things that actually happened. So it was like, diving into my memory pool and remembering a lot, changing some details, but also, I guess, allowing myself the freedom to take certain things out and infuse it with other things as well. I think that's what... I don't think I was worried too much about accuracy. And if, there were points that I wanted there to be more accuracy, I'd go to my mum and ask her, how did this actually happen? Where was it actually located? All that kind of stuff.
It's sort of an emotional truth versus a complete truth, isn't it? That's what we were talking about a little bit before. We
were having a yarn
happily
in the
talk a
greenery
bit
about
about
that.
more, but we probably don't have. But it is that sort of emotional truth you're getting to, as opposed to actually you can't represent perfectly, but you've got to get to you're just trying to get to the general sense of it.
Yeah, exactly. And if I can add,
Please.
I also think, like, with the journey from Egypt and then Sydney and then into Geelong, I think what heavily influenced those chapters is you could very much see my, or feel, I should say, my connection or my relationship with those places. And I think the turning point for me with Geelong is, when I was sort of in grade 5, 6, I'm going into year 7, about learning the first people of this country, and sort of the connection to the land and all that kind of stuff, and understanding even the story about the Yu Yangs, the 3 sisters. Recently I went to a forum where I met with Auntie Nellie, one of the founding members of Wathaurong, and in her acknowledgement she said that we as creatives have a duty, because I don't know about any of you guys, but writing for me is a very spiritual process. So when I was writing Hopeless Kingdom, I was allowing the spirits of the land around me to sort of guide me as well, and I think that in turn sort of enriches and continues to enrich my relationship to place and Geelong.
There's a wonderful sense of that when she's going on the train,
Yeah.
but I won't. People need to read
No
it.
spoilers.
We're nearly at audience question time, so if you've got some questions, just get your minds going. have a bit of a think. Got a question maybe? But I'll ask one more question before then. We're on Wadawurrung country today. Hello, Rhett. I'm still here. Which extends to the Bellarine, Lorne-ish, Ballarat and Skipton. It's very, very big. Is there a particular part of Wadawurrung country that means something special to you or perhaps inspires you as a writer? I grew up in Bellbrae, and there's a beach near Bellbrae, the Point Addis kind of little spot down there. The Ironbark Basin is, and all the trees down there is just pretty much my entire being. Is there any place around here that kind of inspires you as a writer?
Yes. Point Impossible is a very spiritual place.
Yeah.
For saltwater folks out there, and where salt and fresh water combine and come together, and the wetlands just nearby, and the amount of life that's in that part of the world before you sort of hit civilization is a really great place just to go and be. Which is why I think there's so many surfers who try it out. But the other place is probably the Moorabool River, you know, sort of along that walking track, and where it comes together and meets the Barwon, and you know, there's just it's very special. I feel very lost in nature there.
Wonderful. Dorothy, is anywhere in particular in
Point
Geelong?
Lonsdale's my special place now.
Sorry?
Point Lonsdale is
Point Lonsdale,
my special
yep.
place now.
Yep. Lovely. It's a good spot. How about you, Shay?
The Yuyangs. It was one of the first things that I saw coming to Geelong, and it was so grand. It still is. But I'm from that side of town mainly, you know, Corona Lane, and now I live in Lara. So it was just, if you were lost looking for home, look for the Yuyangs, and you'll know where it is. Yeah.
It's wonderful. It's that sense of I love being away, but I when I see that little group of hills, mountains, whatever you want to call them, it's just it's a bit of a sigh. It's a nice sigh. It's a beautiful spot, and obviously very much more than that too to the local people. But okay, we will maybe just do. There's a few microphones maybe going around. I do have plenty of questions myself. If you don't have any, but we've got.
He's
one
had
over
enough. Someone else have a go.
Sorry. Yeah, I've talked enough.
Hi, thanks for... Is it working?
Yep.
Thanks very much for your comments. It's been great. I'm working on a novel at the moment, and it's based on the Bellarine, and my temptation is to vaguify exactly where it's set, just because I kind of feel like that will make it more relatable to more people. I guess I'm just wondering if you think it's important to specify place when you're writing, and if so, why?
We had a discussion about this before,
Well,
but
I've
I'm going to let someone else
already
go
said
for
what
it.
I think about that.
Yeah.
You have to specify it, unless you've got a really good reason not to.
I go on.
No, you go.
I'm the question asker. You have to go.
My instinct is to specify, but you don't have to. You can still be extremely explicit about everything that's in that landscape without giving it its name. Because I think one of the things that's really interesting in this country is to think about what names mean and the layers of names and which name and why. And there's kind of a lot of different reasons why you may or may not use a name. So I'm a fence sitter. And I think you can really go both ways with intention and have a really great outcome. But if you walk along the Bellarine, you know, like all that beautiful Moona forest country and saltbush, and, you know, these are the things that kind of sing out to me when I'm down that way. You can still talk about all of those things, what they feel like and the vibe they're giving you. And we'll probably all go, I've walked that country. I've been a place just like that. Whether it's that one or a bit further down the coast.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's specified if it feels important to you. But again, if you have your reasons, that's totally fine as well. I mean, in the book, there are parts of Geelong that I did specify, but some bits that weren't shone a positive light on. I just changed the names completely, but you all in the room would know where I'm talking about. But yeah, I think just do what feels right for you.
I named a specific pub, which still exists, where my ancestors were racially vilified, and what happened in that pub and that incident, and at the end of the day, it is what it is. It happened. It's true. I'm not shying away from the fact that needs to be talked about, but that's with intention. If there might be random pubs where they went in Egypt that I'll never be able to track down the name for, and I'm not worried about that either. You can still talk about what happened there. Yeah.
I think it depends on the effect you're trying to get to as well, right? And what you're trying to achieve as a reader. I mean, readers are going to connect to a specific place sometimes, and just through the name of it as well, as you talked about. And so, do you want them to do that, or do you want to make it a more of a less just about the spirit of the place or what it feels like to be in that place, as opposed to all that other stuff? Any other questions there? We've got one down here.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm interested, as you're writing to progress the narrative in the story, how do you maintain the balance between character and place? How the characters are responding to place, and in fact how place is responding to the characters?
Interesting.
I think this is one where we're going to have a few differences between novelists and playwrights as well.
Possibly, yes, yeah.
I mean, for me as a playwright, the characters are absolutely essential throughout. And in the play, The Mission, the narrator builds the world. So the narrator is intrinsically throughout, that you can't escape, because everything that you're seeing is effectively what I'm telling you. There was sort of no separation between world and character. They had to coexist and continually inform each other. But I guess I'm always coming at that from the actor's perspective as well, knowing that the character has to be displayed at all times, that I'm present on stage. And so when I'm doing the writing process, I'm also thinking about how I'm going to be acting it and what material I'm giving myself if I'm going to be the actor, or if it's someone else. You're still doing the same acting work to try and make sure that they've got enough to go with.
I think a lot depends on whether you have a first-person narrative or a third-person narrative. I mean, One for the Masters is obviously told in the first person, and she embodies the place, the young girl who starts the story. But if you've got third person, you can choose whether to have a God's eye view or whether to have separate characters embody different elements. Personally, I don't really like the God's eye view that much. I mean, I prefer to get it through the characters.
So there's a closeness that you can get to place through first person. Is that what you're saying?
That's my preference personally, but it's not exclusively, but largely.
Right there, actually.
Well, from the perspectives that I write from, the place and the character sort of feed and inform each other, and especially with Tarasai and Akita. More with Akita, just so because she's, growing up in Australia and all that kind of stuff, you sort of see how she sees Australia through her lens. So, you see Australia, you see Geelong through a particular lens. And so, I sort of just allowed that to happen naturally. I did use a lot of, the experiences that I've had in Geelong, a lot of my own memories, and I sort of infused it into this character. But it was this thing that sort of happened organically. It wasn't something that I had to keep remembering to, do or bring up, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Great. And the story is very much very character-driven story.
Yes.
That just the place sort of gets infused within it, but it happens quite organically there too. Any other questions there? Got one just down the back there as well.
This is kind of piggybacking off the question in and around how characters inform place and place informs characters. I have a background more working in cinema and have worked on a variety of projects where place is its own character within that particular context. So I kind of wanted to to get people's impressions in and around that, but also how these stories can imprint on places. Places that are sacred, places that have long history, how much it infuses into those places where there have been industry and people have walked those streets every day with a particular purpose, how much that can actually slowly seep into the area and exist in that kind of space.
Yeah, good question. Anyone
This was the ending of the mission, like that whole, what you've just summarised, that sort of spiritual idea of what story is encoded in country, and you know, this idea of being able to go and touch something, like, and for me in the play it was a stone, and I kept coming back to stones in the sort of the last like epilogue of the play, like what is this thing that I'm trying to grasp at? And it turned out that what I was really trying to draw together was, you know, the stones of the church that was destroyed and blown up, and the stories that lived in those stones, the sweat and tears of Gunishmara men who carried those stones on their shoulder to build this church for a God that was introduced and that they didn't know anything about, and then for that to be taken, you know, many years later and removed. And what does that mean? But you can take the stone away, but the story is still encoded there. And then, you know, one of the things that happened, as I mentioned before, that we were able to mark Uncle Alan's grave with a headstone. And so what does it mean to go and touch that stone, and what story now lives through that stone that we've left behind about him, but also the other stones that are sort of present in the last section of the play. Yeah. That was the section I was going to read if you were asking me to read.
Absolutely, that would have been awesome. But yeah, sorry. Go on, Dorothy.
Oh, well, this may be sort of a tangential response to the question, but I mean, stories imprinting on place, that's why we have literary pilgrims, because they want to visit the place where Wuthering Heights took, you know, they want to go there. My favourite literary pilgrim story is about a Russian novel, and a Russian novelist. The novel's called The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. And that's about how when the devil came to Moscow. And they run tours. And people go to see the bench that the devil sat on when he came to Moscow, which I think is a wonderful story. It's a wonderful literary pilgrimage story, and it shows that this absurd fiction has really influenced the way that people think.
It's gone beyond the page, hasn't it? It's now
Well,
you know,
yeah, I think
encoded into the place where it was
it's
set.
encoded
Yeah,
into that
become-
particular.
yeah.
I don't know if people still go to see the bench the devil sat on when he came to Moscow, but I've always remembered that story.
Can we think of any local examples of that, even if it's a Melbourne example? Is there a piece of Melbourne or Victorian kind of...
Hanging Rock?
So which one?
Hanging Rock?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
People
pretty
go
much
to
it,
Hanging
isn't it?
Rock.
Yeah. In my case, I kind of my book, the city itself is a character because it moves, it does its own thing, and that's my own weird sort of thing. But the idea of the city being a character was absolutely central. It was the fourth main character as far as I was concerned, because it is kind of capricious and it does its own sort of thing. But that is absolutely just a general sort of thing anyway. Having the setting as being a separate character that people are kind of moving around and
It
bouncing
fundamentally impacts on your characters.
Yeah.
Whether they like it or not.
Yep.
You
Exactly.
know, whether it's the tempest arriving or,
Yep.
you know, whatever. The place has a way of enacting upon people, and that's been the story of certainly of this continent for tens of thousands of years. But the last 200, we know a lot about that. We know what that sounds and feels like emotionally, and people have written about this a lot, to struggle against place. But then when you flip the tables and say, what does it mean to live with place and in concert with place and in rhythm with, that's a very different relationship between those characters. So I agree.
We're going to have to draw it to a close. I would like to hear some more, but I'm sorry, with the numbers saying 3:58. Thank you so much, Jack, Dorothy and Tom. Just give a round of applause to our panellists today. Thank you so much. Really great conversation. Just a reminder that the Festival Bookseller, the Bookbird, has a pop-up bookstore on the ground floor. Ki Kiri Niche, I knew I'd get that wrong, apologies. Ki Kiri Niche, operating all day today, where you can purchase books by all of the authors here and all the other ones featured in Local Word, including many back copies. Wrong page. Finish up. Come on. There we go. We will also be signing books on the ground floor over the next half an hour or so for anyone who would like to have the books signed. Of course, many of our titles are also available through this amazing library and the network of libraries around the region. And look, I have to put a personal thank you out to the library who always does such a wonderful job of this stuff and supports local writers, and that really is wonderful. We really do appreciate it as writers. Today's event has been recorded. If you'd like to watch or listen to this discussion again or recommend it to family or friends, it will be uploaded to the library's YouTube channel within the next couple of days. Thank you to everyone for coming along today, and once again, can you please join me in thanking Jack, Tom and Dorothy. Thanks a lot.
Aren't we lucky to have our libraries?
Yeah.
Aren't we? Worth
Yeah.
fighting for,
It's-
I'd say.
I want to kind of just say more about that, but yeah, thanks libraries. We love you. We really do.